Welcome back to the Lutheran History Podcast, where we cover over 500 years of Lutheran history. Today, we're going to try a whole new format. We're still covering Lutheran history, but we're going to have a discussion about some major significant works in Lutheran history by authors who are not available for an interview. So today, we're going to have our regular special guest, Dr. Tim Grundmeier from Martin Luther College. We're going to discuss two significant books about Lutheranism in antebellum America. First is Paul Kuenning's The Rise and Fall of American Lutheran Pietism, the Rejection of an Activist Heritage. And later on in part two, we'll talk about David Gustafson's Lutherans in Crisis, the question of Lutheran identity in the American Republic. These are both provocative and still relevant works. Well, we'll talk about how relevant they are later. We're going to take turns. First, we'll have Tim here is going to be the main guy talking about the rise and fall of American Lutheran Pietism. Then we'll switch and I'll talk more about the Lutherans in Crisis. So Tim, thanks for joining us once again today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So first, we're going to talk about the rise and fall of American Lutheran Pietism. What can you tell us about the background of this book?
Yeah, okay. And again, thanks, Ben, for having me back. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while because these are two books that really, are pretty foundational for understanding the study of Lutheran history in the antebellum United States and even into the Civil War era. So Kuenning wrote this book in 1988. It was a revision of his doctoral dissertation. I'm very sure of that. I believe it was at Marquette where he did his doctoral dissertation. And how I see Kuenning's book is he's reacting against certain standard interpretations of Lutheranism in antebellum America. So by that, I mean, so roughly from like the founding of the General Synod in 1820 through the conflicts over confessional subscription and church unity in the 1850s. That's kind of the period that he's focusing on. And so the standard work on this topic, really for 60 years before he wrote his book, was a book published in the 1920s called The Crisis in American Lutheran Theology by a guy named Virgilius Firm. And that book argued that there were these two competing Lutheranisms that emerged in antebellum America. So you had what Firm called an American Lutheranism, represented by people like Samuel Schmucker, kind of the lead character in that. And this American Lutheranism seeking to adapt Lutheran theology to the United States. And then on the flip side, you had an old Lutheranism, is the term Firm used for kind of opposition. And that was represented by various figures, and Firm saw them as trying to preserve Lutheran theology as it was inherited from Europe. And for Firm, the culmination of this dispute was the controversy over the definite platform. In 1855, I know we've talked about this on a couple times I've been on your show before. But just basically, the definite platform was this idea, a proposal put forward by Schmucker and some of his allies to create what he called an American recension to the Augsburg Confession, essentially modifying certain teachings, specifically that plan falls flat. And so Firm's kind of conclusion was that a developing American Lutheran theology, I'm quoting him here now, was suppressed, and in its place there came the rebirth of an inherited European Lutheran theology in America. And so after Firm, pretty much everyone follows the basic outlines of his interpretation. Firm actually, I think, is pretty sympathetic writing back in the 1920s to the quote unquote American Lutherans. But others, on the other hand, are less sympathetic to them. So as I mentioned, Kuenning's book comes out in 1988. It's a revision of his doctoral dissertation from Marquette a few years before. And he's basically wanting to challenge some aspects of this kind of long-standing interpretation. Does that kind of make sense, do you think?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
this is one of those things where we're talking about, this is a historiography episode more so than others, where we're not so much, they all are, but we're not so much just talking about a new topic or a new person. We're talking about the history of history on this. So yeah, that definitely makes sense how he is he's analyzing previous arguments, and I think you summarized those well. And that's something we'll see later on in Gustafson too, where he seems to kind of, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, he seems to be okay with that American Lutheran and the old Lutheran progression.
I would agree. I think Gustafson's trying to kind of almost revitalize the older interpretation, and he's taking on Kuenning who in a few ways. So maybe I should get into what the actual argument of Kuenning's book is.
Sure.
And maybe that would make sense. So the argument of Kuenning's book is the best way to understand these so-called American Lutherans, represented by people like Schmucker, is that they are the inheritors of Lutheran pietism, and especially the emphasis coming out of Lutheran pietism on heartfelt religious experience, sanctified living, and then also social activism. And so that's kind of the first part of his argument. And the second part is that the opposition to Schmucker and his allies, coming from the old Lutherans, to use Firm's phrase, the strict confessionalists is what Kuenning calls them. It's not only about debates over the authority of the Lutheran confessions or the nature of the sacraments. Now, Kuenning doesn't deny that those things don't play a role, but he sees one of the, if not the chief hostility towards people like Schmucker as opposition to their social activism, and especially to their Schmucker's stand on the slavery question. And so that's how he differs from the traditional interpretation put forward by Firm. He sees Schmucker's ideas coming not chiefly from the American context, but from the European heritage of Lutheran pietism. So Kuenning doesn't really like the term American Lutheranism. This is coming out of the Lutheran pietist tradition, much of Schmucker's theology and activism. And so Kuenning also doesn't see this controversy in the 1850s as over theology. He's seen it as over theology, but it's just as much over these social and political issues, the slavery issue being one of them.
Yeah.
It's not the predominant one.
Yeah, I mean, the next part is going to be the summary of the book's contents. I could basically summarize it for you right now. It's Pietism and Slavery. That's the the book.
It is.
Yeah,
it is. And I mean, that's kind of maybe the most overarching thing Kuenning's trying to do. He's trying to kind of revitalize, or at least rehabilitate the reputation of Schmucker and his allies. He's definitely pro Schmucker, at least how he understands Schmucker. And I would say that in some cases, well, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but Kuenning maybe doesn't fully understand Schmucker as well as he thinks he does, in my opinion, but we can get to that.
That was going to be one of my comments coming up too. But let's take a big step back without getting too far ahead. Basically, we have this contrast, the typical contrast, which he's pushing back against a little bit, but he's also working within this framework of pietism versus confessionalism for Lutherans. And we can't just talk about this in a bubble, because this is really an issue. And he brings this out too. This has been a divide among Lutherans for well over 100 years by the time he introduces Schmucker and American Lutheranism and slavery. Do you care to just maybe define or redefine for us today, what is confessionalism? Why is that seen as social activism, maybe, or pietism, and why that is social activism, at least in his view, and confessionalism is more of an academic thing?
No, that's a great question. I mean, rereading the book in advance for this conversation, there was at one point, I don't have the quote in front of me, where Kuenning essentially says what you see playing out in America in the 19th century is basically the same controversy as occurred in Germany in the late 17th and early 18th century between the Orthodox Party and the Pietist Party. Now, I don't think that's true per se, but yeah, I mean, confessionalism, I mean, at basic issue theologically is, I mean, this is how they talk about it in the 19th century. Are the doctrinal statements in the Augsburg Confession true? Fully true. People like Schmucker will say that the fundamental doctrines in the Augsburg Confession are true, but someone like Schmucker will question or outright reject the idea of the real presence in the Lord's Supper. The idea of baptismal regeneration is another idea that he rejects. How Pietism plays into this, the Pietist movement in Germany, several hundred years before Schmucker, now about 150 years before Schmucker is when it originates, is reacting against what they see as an overemphasis on strict doctrine, if you will. Their criticism is that some people within the Lutheran Orthodoxy are making the precise understanding of doctrine really the only aspect of Christianity. And so Pietists will emphasize, heartfelt religious experience as an important component of Christianity. They'll emphasize also that Christianity needs to manifest itself in lives of sanctification, and that means a lot of different things to them. I can maybe talk about that once we get into the summary of Kuenning's book. I find that I'm not an expert on the 17th and 18th centuries in Germany, but I find that the dichotomy between Orthodoxy and Pietism is sometimes, I mean, it's real, but it's not as stark always as some people make it out to be. I mean,
it can
Orthodox. Yeah, it can be. Yeah. I mean, or the people in the camp of Lutheran Orthodoxy cared about sanctification, and people like Philip Jakob Spener, kind of the founder of Lutheran Pietism, cared about Lutheran doctrine too. So, and sometimes they can be gradations rather than strict camps, but maybe I'm getting into the weeds a little here.
Well, I think it's helpful to understand. So when we're talking about confessionalism, it's usually black or white. Are you confessional or not? Do you agree with the doctrines professed in the Book of Concord? Are they correct or aren't they? Yes, they are. Okay. And a pietist won't necessarily disagree with any of that. Some will and some don't. It's that gray area. And one of the points he makes, I think, is a lot of that, not 17th, maybe more of the 18th century pietism, a lot of that was within confessional Lutheranism. So he's saying it's not really always a conflict, but maybe we are a bit off too far in the weeds, but we should probably understand that distinction between a pietist perspective and a confessional Lutheran perspective. Yeah,
and just one little final note on that. Kuenning makes the argument that, Schmucker he calls him at one point a moderate confessionalist, whereas, his opponents are strict confessionalists. Okay. Again, we're getting into these terminologies where it's like, anyway, what do they even mean? But I mean, Schmucker has a somewhat high regard for the Lutheran confessions. I mean, he organizes his theology textbook around the Augsburg Confession, and he's actually trying to counteract what he sees as people who are throwing out the entirety of the Lutheran heritage by embracing almost a deistic understanding of the Christian faith. Schmucker, he's just an interesting figure in many ways. But sorry, once again, getting on a tangent here. So I'll let you. Where should we go next?
Well, can we just walk through the book's content?
Yeah, that's
contents. I don't know if you have a broad outline you want to take us through first, and then get into the detail, or what do you want to do?
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, I see Kuenning's book as there's I think 7 chapters, but it's divided really into 3 parts, even though it's not labeled that way. So the first two chapters are it's kind of laying the basic background for what he's trying to do here. And so chapter 1 gives a basic overview of Lutheran Pietism as it emerged in the late 17th and early 18th century. He talks about people like Philip Jakob Spener, the kind of founder of German Lutheran Pietism, the person that kind of inherits that mantle, August Hermann Francke, what Kuenning's really trying to emphasize is the activist side of Lutheran Pietism. So it's emphasis on mission work, its founding of orphan houses, its work on the behalf of the poor, for example. And also, again, as we kind of alluded to before, trying to contrast it with the Lutheran orthodoxy against which it's reacting, from which it's breaking. The next chapter then, after kind of laying down this foundation of what was Lutheran Pietism, his next chapter, he's trying to show that the first 100 or so years of Lutheranism in the United States, so from the arrival of Heinrich Melchior Muhlenberg in the 1780s through the founding of the General Synod in the 1820s, that this beginning of Lutheranism in America is characterized by a pietist kind of Lutheranism. So he straight up says Muhlenberg, pietist, and many of Muhlenberg's associates are pietists in Kuenning's interpretation. And so when Schmucker finally emerges on the scene, Kuenning's showing that he's kind of standing in this pietist tradition that had been in the United States really since the colonial era. And so what Schmucker's trying to do in Kuenning's telling is kind of revitalize this pietist tradition, continue this pietist tradition, and applying Lutheran pietist principles and ideas to the situation in the early Republic and antebellum United States. Does that sound like a fair summary?
Yeah, and it's pretty clear here that Schmucker is, if we're going to identify an individual, this isn't a biography, but it almost reads like it sometimes. Yeah. Schmucker's the guy, and that's just the one we have to deal with. It's sometimes convenient, sometimes it's oversimplified. I mean, very often it's oversimplified. Yeah. But it isn't too much of a stretch to say he is kind of the driving force among this, whatever you want to call it, pietist, activist, American Lutheran movement.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think in reality, you're right. He is central. You can't get away from that. There are other people who are almost just as significant, and in some respects even more so, but we don't have to get into that now. Okay, so that's kind of the first two chapters, laying out that kind of basis of his argument. The next two chapters in the book gets into where he kind of outlines the content of this American Lutheran pietism, as he calls it, especially the activist side of this American Lutheran pietism. So he talks about Schmucker's and other American Lutherans' emphasis on sanctification, post-millennialism, revivalism, ecumenism, moral reform, temperance reform, and finally, kind of where it ends is abolitionism, and he'll actually devote an entire chapter to that. And so, again, what Kuenning's trying to show is that Schmucker and others' stances on these issues are drawing on this Lutheran pietist tradition. And it's at this point also that he brings in, if you will, kind of the second character of the book, but it's not a person, it's a church body, the Franckian Synod, who factors very heavily in Kuenning's analysis. And the Franckian Synod is founded in the 1830s in upstate New York. It's an independent Lutheran church body. It doesn't join the General Synod. In fact, it's rejected from the General Synod for a time, and then it refuses to join the General Synod until 1864. And the Franckians are social activists, even more so than Schmucker, and particularly on the issue of abolitionism. We can get into like how we should actually characterize Schmucker's anti-slavery views, but I think it's fair to characterize the Franckians as true abolitionists.
Right. And let's just pause there. Just for American history stuff, we make a distinction, right? You could be anti-slavery without being abolitionist. And
Yeah,
that's something I ran into my earlier years of, no, they're not all the same. Abolitionists mean slavery is a sin. It is pure evil. Get rid of slavery. Whereas a lot of people were saying, well, slavery obviously doesn't look too good. Let's not do it, or let's not expand it. So the Frankians would be more of that abolitionist, and they're named after that pietist figure, which I think is their name is We Are a Pietist Group, which I think is what he picks up on too.
Yeah, and I will. Yeah, I tend to think of that. Well, having studied the Frankians somewhat myself, that's something to me. That's something of a gloss. But man, if we can maybe get into that the criticisms of the book. Yeah, and right. I think the phrase abolitionism, Kuenning does not. He uses that term a little loosely. Another big distinction between people that are ardently abolitionist and those who are broadly anti-slavery. It's not just the moral question of slavery, it's also what to do about it. So, Garrisonian abolitionists will advocate immediatism. This is after the famous anti-slavery advocate, William Lloyd Garrison. So, no compensation for slaveholders, no gradual emancipation, end it now, no questions asked. This has to be done. Whereas there's gradations on the and Schmucker is definitely more on the maybe not quite gradual emancipation, but he is somewhat sympathetic to the plight of the South. We can get into Schmucker's own kind of contradictions when it comes to slaveholding maybe later. But let's just say, abolitionism does Kuenning maybe deploys that term a little too loosely. I'll just say it at this point. So he lays he first lays the background, then gets into what the content of the Schmucker/Frankians social activism look like. And then the kind of final part of the book, the last couple chapters, is trying to reinterpret the conflict over confessionalism, the conflict between the, whatever you want to call them, American Lutherans versus the confessionalists, the pietists versus the confessionalists, in the context of, their disagreements, at least as Kuenning perceives them, over the slavery issue. How's that sound?
Sounds good.
Yeah, that's that. And so what Kuenning does in chapter 5 is he's trying to imply and demonstrate that Schmucker's anti-slavery views played a significant role in opposition to his theology. And well, we can get into whether I buy that or not. We'll get maybe into that later. And then the next chapter 6, he's trying to show that the opposition to the Frankian Synod, particularly in 1864, so during the Civil War, when the Frankian Synod applies for admission to the General Synod, that their abolitionism is one of the reasons why at that meeting, certain groups within the General Synod begin to move away from it. And eventually the chain reaction from the 1864 meeting is going to lead to the founding of a new Lutheran federation to rival the General Synod, the General Council. People like Charles Porterfield Krauth, William Passavant are going to be key figures in breaking away from the General Synod. And this process starts in 1864, culminates in 1867 with the founding of the General Council. And what Kuenning's trying to prove is that these confessionalists are motivated in part, maybe even primarily, by we can't have this abolitionist synod in the General Synod, is kind of where he's going. And so that's the kind of the summary of Kuenning's book. He concludes his book with, in his conclusion, kind of lamenting the downfall of American Lutheran pietism. Would you like me to read that final paragraph? Would that be helpful? Or
why don't you? Let's hear it in his own words.
Yeah. Because I'm trying to characterize Kuenning's argument correctly here. Let me see if I can find it here. Great podcast listening now with me turning the pages. Found it.
It's authentic.
Yeah, exactly. Here's his final paragraph. It is a regrettable fact of history that both Samuel Schmucker and the Frankian Synod were denounced by the Lutheran majority for an alleged doctrinal deviation never adequately defined and motivated in part by an animosity directed toward their abolitionism. Even more regrettable in the process, many positive contributions of their pietist tradition and theology, particularly their moral activism and humanitarianism, have been ignored and forgotten. It is my hope that this history may in some small way contribute to a process of recovering these precious lost treasures. So he's certainly at, by the end, I mean, he is
got an axe to grind.
Yes, he sees, and we'll talk about this with Gustafson too, and they both very much see the controversies of the antebellum era and Civil War as directly relevant to Lutherans when they're writing the late 20th century. Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'll just say it now. I think if he wrote this book today, the title would just be a little bit different. He would say The Rise and Fall of American Lutheran Pietism, the Rejection of a Social Justice Heritage. Yeah, right? I think that's kind of how I read it, is that's what he's writing it as.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although, yeah, I think that's a fair characterization. So anyway, yeah. Anything else on the book itself that you thought I missed?
Well, I mean, you didn't tell us the entire book, but no, I think you summarized.
Yeah,
I think you summarized it.
Maybe too much.
No. Well, let's just then talk about now that we are aware of what the book is about. How has the book been received?
Yeah,
sometimes tricky to.
Yeah, the book was published 40 years ago now, right? Or no, 30 years ago, if it's late 80s. Almost. Yeah, about 30 years ago. I can't do math off the top of my head. So about 32, 33 years ago. I mean, at the time, what's unique about the book, or not unique, but interesting, it's not published by a Lutheran press. It's published by Mercer University Press. So in some ways, that's a welcome thing because it gets Lutheran history more out there in the scholarly community. I noticed that this book was reviewed by several non-Lutheran journals like Church History. I think it was reviewed in the Journal of Church and State, maybe a couple others as well. And, it received fairly positive reviews at the time. The classic lines, makes an important contribution. I would say in American Lutheran historiography, Kuenning's version of this story really hasn't been incorporated. I mean, I think a lot of Lutheran historians have an inkling that, especially the issue of slavery had to play some important role. But I think most aren't really sure if they fully buy how Kuenning frames it, or at least if they do buy it, put it this way. In Mark Granquist's, I looked at this before our interview. Mark Granquist wrote the survey of Lutheranism in America a few years ago. It's a really good survey. I didn't really see much of Kuenning's ideas incorporated into that. I could be misremembering. So yeah, it's difficult to say. I would say, it's still a very important book about this era in American Lutheran history. It makes some important arguments, but it's difficult. It's always difficult to say how influential it is. But my hunch is it doesn't really, it hasn't really altered how most Lutheran history is told about this period. No. But maybe, what do you think?
Well, I think, he really puts himself out there at the end, and you read that conclusion, I think, for a good reason. And I don't think that's its reception versus its impact, I guess, are two different questions. Yeah, how has it been received? I haven't heard or read too much about it, so maybe is that a silent rejection? I haven't really seen it incorporated, like you've said, into other articles or books or things like that. At least not in a major way.
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
I am aware of it, and I did stumble across it. So I mean, it's definitely out there, and it's
yeah,
part of the
yeah.
historiography for sure.
It might, and could be wrong, but in just kind of my brief sample, it strikes me though that of Lutheran histories of American Lutheranism known outside of kind of our internal American Lutheran circles, I mean, it did a better job of pushing American Lutheran history beyond just our narrow parochial conversations, which I think is, well, it's one of the, if we want to get into what I see as kind of the strengths of the book, I think is one of its contributions. But I don't know. You want to go there?
Yeah, let's talk about strengths now that you brought that up. So it's a strength of putting Lutheranism out there. In what ways?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's just start. I mean, what I like about the book is it makes a clear and provocative argument. You don't have to read between the lines on what Kuenning is arguing. It's not a dull book. I think the writing's pretty good. You know precisely where he stands on this question of history and this question of the role of slavery and other issues in the formation of Lutheran identity in the antebellum era. So that's one positive. I said this to you before we had this podcast begin. I also like this book because it's asking important questions. So too often in my mind, the history of Lutheranism in the United States is done without paying attention to the larger social, cultural, and political contexts. It's almost as if Lutheranism operates in this pristine bubble, unaffected or uninfluenced or unconcerned with what's going on in the larger culture and politics of the United States. So he's trying to incorporate debates about slavery into the story of American Lutheran history. And I think he should be commended for that, because I think, as I kind of put to you, he's asking a lot of good questions and bringing some important issues to bear. What about you? Do you have any strengths that you see in the book?
Yeah, I think, like you said, those questions, he's talking about stuff other people weren't really focused on. Like the problem, and both of these books try to do that. They try to isolate a couple issues where the general histories just breeze on past everything because they have to. So this is kind of like, let's slow down, let's take off the cruise control, so to speak, and really dig into something. And he does, and like you said, he does that well. I always, not pretty much always, when we look at a Lutheran history book, I kind of see, okay, how seriously can I take this based on how many sources are you using? Like, are you just copying what three other guys said and putting it to your own words? Or are you doing a lot of primary research? And he certainly has done a lot of research with that. So he passes that test of being original, and he backs it up.
Yeah, he does a good job digging into some of the writings of Schmucker himself, getting into like the minutes of the Frankian Synod and some of for a brief period, I believe they have a little church paper that they put out there. I would say that the opponents of Schmucker and the Frankians, he does not really look at in depth when it comes to primary sources. And I think that's, in my mind, where some of the weaknesses of the book end up being. But yeah, I mean, this is certainly a book that tries to make uses a sizable number of primary sources to make an original argument. That's for sure.
He's not speaking from ignorance. Let's put it that way. He's aware of the topics and the context.
This is his doctoral dissertation revised into a book. So it's for sure.
You got to take it seriously, even if you find weaknesses in it. So that's a transition. Let's go to weaknesses.
Okay.
Then.
Yeah. And it's always, kind of nerve-wracking to talk about the weaknesses of, a book, no one's here to defend him. But I think the first weakness I see is I just don't see pietism exerting as tremendous an influence on Schmucker and other American Lutherans as Kuenning makes it out to be. Now, there's some influence, and you occasionally see, if you look at the primary sources, Lutheran pietists being invoked. I mean, you just look at the name of the Frankian Synod. It's it's named after a famous Lutheran pietist. But from my reading of the history, the predominant these Lutherans in this time period is the evangelicalism coming out of the Second Great Awakening.
Yep.
I mean, this is who Schmucker and the Frankians are trying to imitate, make partnerships with, in their emphasis on revivalism, in their emphasis on temperance, and just various other ideas. I see them more as influenced by their American context than by this movement in Germany 100 years ago.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, basically, like let's look at this kind of like from a medical perspective where I have no training, but let's just say he has these symptoms, right? He sees Schmucker and friends. They like things like temperance. They like things like Sabbatarianism, right? You must go to church. So you like Sunday schools. You like revivals. Okay, well, where does this come from? That's kind of the question this book asks. And he traces this in a really roundabout way back to, like you said, 17th century Europe, when it's much more obvious, it's from his neighbor down the road who's an American evangelical. Yeah. Or maybe he picked this up in the Presbyterian seminary he went to. Yeah. And when I see Schmucker referring to the Pietists, he's not saying, look, we should do this because the Pietists did that. He's saying, no, look, those guys of the First Great Awakening, they were friends with Pietists. So see, our Lutheran ancestors were just as Americanized as we are, to use the word American in that sense. So they're really like, we're American Protestants first who conveniently find Pietist overlap.
Yeah, or even putting a slightly less cynical spin on it. If Spener or Franke were alive today, he would be in our camp. They would be in our camp. Maybe is another way to think of it. Like we cut. So I mean, there's not zero connection, but I think the predominant influence is American evangelicalism, in my view. The other main interpretive issue, or you want to say anything more on that, or should I go on to my other kind of big beef?
The one note I wrote down was, well, going back earlier, he was trying to make the point that, well, you see, it's not. Don't worry about this confessionalism thing. It's not that bad of a difference. And he was basically saying these Pietists in Germany were totally confessional. Then he went on talking about all their millennialist ideas. Yeah. And it's like, that's not really confessional then. That's something else. And so I think his defining of what is confessional and why, he never really got back to the source of biblical interpretation. Wasn't really part of this discussion. It was more of what are you doing, not where are you getting your doctrine from. Yeah.
No, I think that's fair.
Yeah. And the other question I just kind of wrote down was, does he ignore how clearly Americanized Schmucker is? Yeah. And I think we talked about that. But.
Yeah. I think, well, maybe we can get into that, the idea of what is Americanism or Americanization when we get into Gustafson's book, because that comes up quite a bit. So I'll maybe save my thoughts on that.
Sure.
Let me talk about the other my other, and probably even more, my even bigger interpretive difference with Kuenning is on the role that slavery plays in these debates in the antebellum United States among American Lutherans. I don't think the story Kuenning tells is quite correct. We already talked about how he kind of overstates Schmucker's anti-slavery views. Again, calling him an abolitionist to me is a bit of a category error. I mean, and Kuenning even acknowledges some of these things. I mean, Schmucker ends up being a slave owner. No self-respecting abolitionist, whatever. I mean, now,
I think it's through his wife, isn't it?
It is. It's through his second wife. He remarries, and his second wife inherits slaves. And Schmucker's view is, if I'm not mistaken, I should double check. It's been a while since I've delved into this, but it's either one or two African Americans, and at least one of them is very old. And so the thought is like, I don't know if Schmucker actually asked this individual, but is that, at this point in time, freeing this elderly African American man would be, counterproductive or something like that. I'm not trying to justify it, right? That's kind of Schmucker's view. So basically, Schmucker is a moderate anti-slavery. And this is the thing, there's a wide range of anti-slavery ideas in the United States embraced by evangelicals. And so, Schmucker's views stand on the continuum of various types of evangelical anti-slavery attitudes. The second thing, though, besides just overstating Schmucker's anti-slavery ideas, is he doesn't get the alliances right, in my view, on this question. So this might get a little complicated, but I have some stake in this because this is one of the things I write about in my own dissertation, and maybe hopefully someday book. So the American Lutheran Party, or even using Kuenning's term, the Pietist Party, is strong not only in parts of Pennsylvania and New York, but it's also the predominant type of Lutheranism found in the South. So some of the most ardent proponents of revivalism, temperance advocacy, more ecumenical relations with other Protestants, downplaying or even rejecting the traditional Lutheran understanding of the sacraments. These are found, this is the predominant type of Lutheranism found in the South. So you have like Benjamin Kurtz, the editor of the Lutheran Observer in Maryland, which is a Southern state. I mean, we don't always think of it because it's on the border, but yeah, it's a Southern state, it's a slave-only state, and Kurtz bans in the Lutheran Observer any talk of abolitionism because we are not going to touch this issue, right? And he himself personally advocates, and even contradictorily will advocate for it sometimes in the Lutheran Observer, the idea of colonization, that we said the best way to deal with the slavery issue is to send freed African slaves to, say, Africa, like Liberia. And then you also have in the Deep South, in South Carolina, John Bachman, who is on the same page when it comes to Schmucker and Kurtz in many aspects of theology, except on the issue of slavery, where Bachman is probably the most ardently pro-slavery Lutheran in the United States.
Yeah,
I interrupted you.
No, that's fine. He's so pro-South, I guess. John Bachman, this Lutheran guy, this is just an interesting anecdote. He led the opening prayer for the South Carolina secession session. So he's like literally up front starting essentially the Civil War. So
that's exactly right.
Evoking the Civil War in the name of God, basically.
Yeah. And so on the flip side, the confessionalists, I don't like the term old Lutherans for these, but the confessional movement within the General Synod. So I'm talking about people like Charles Porterfield Krauth, William Passavant. They're all pretty vocal, especially once you get, before the Civil War, Passavant is pretty vocally anti-slavery, but during the Civil War, so is Krauth. And these confessionalists are almost exclusively found in the northern states. So they don't have any of these kind of ties to Southern Lutherans that are holding them back from being vocal about the slavery issue. And so what's going on here, basically in the build-up to the Civil War in the 1850s, and during the first years of the Civil War, the American Lutherans in the North are kind of almost trying to appease Southern Lutherans by kind of avoiding the issue, even if they disagree, while the confessional Lutherans feel free to speak out against slavery. So, I mean, slavery plays a big role in these debates between the different parties in the General Synod, but not really in the way that Kuenning says. And what's interesting is you look at Kuenning's sources on anti-slavery discussions with like say Schmucker and the Frankians. He's focusing especially on the 1830s and 1840s. Once you get to the 1850s, it kind of falls off the documentation. At one point, he even says something along the lines of, I actually have the page right here. He says, hard evidence or documented proof is lacking for an affirmative answer to the question. And the question he's referring to is how much these slavery debates affected the confessional dispute. And he's kind of implying or outright stating something that, if he had studied the confessional side of the question, he might be pretty surprised at what he found. So did that all make sense?
Yeah, basically, just to recap what you're saying, he's saying pietist good, confessional bad as far as social justice activism. He's basically saying the pietists were the ones we Americans would have liked today on their social issue stance when it comes to racism and slavery. It almost feels like he's accusing, so anyone who's a confessional today, you should feel bad about yourself because you're the people that would be part of your synods today were the pro-slavery ones, but that's really oversimpling it.
Yeah,
but
maybe
that's kind of my impression he's giving. Do you want to push back?
I'm just not as blunt as you, I guess. There's a kind of an implication. So these people were more conservative, if you want to use that word, in theology. That must mean they were more conservative on the slavery issue. When in fact, actually, it's a lot more complicated than that when you actually look at the writings of the late 1850s and early 1860s. So yeah, I'm not. This is the other place where I'm really not convinced of his argument.
Yeah, well, you're saying there are pietists who are both pro and anti-slavery. So just to put them all in the same camp is not good history, and it's a unsupportable conclusion. As far as the weaknesses, he almost slanders the confessional side. He says, well, William Passavant was one of the only guys who actually did anything for other people. He basically says, and it's like, you're just because you haven't portrayed it, like those confessional Lutherans did a lot of stuff. And in fact, you could almost say, especially in the Missouri Synod, they're like a hybrid confessional pietist mindset. And in Wisconsin too, to some degree, where they're from these mission societies that ran orphanages in Europe. They have that as part of their heritage and their background. And what they do with their school systems is very much this activist mentality, in his own words. So I think he undersells that too.
And within the kind of the General Synod, and it'll split and become the General Synod and General Council. I mean, Passavant is firmly on the, if you will, confessionalist side, but super active in founding hospitals. I mean, look, the hospital in one of the chief hospitals in Milwaukee. I mean, traces it's time back to Passavant, and also orphan houses. I mean, I would say that Lutherans across the board in the 19th century are trying to be fairly active in these areas of, benevolence and humanitarianism. And again, like on the slavery issue, I would say the American Lutheran side is more fractured on that, where at least within the General Synod. Now we can get into like the Missouri Synod and slavery. That's a whole nother topic beyond the scope of this conversation. But even like the relationship between religion and politics, I mean, there's a wide variety on the American Lutheran side saying like how much political commentary should Lutheran church papers engage in. And on the confessionalist side, there's similar division, but if not anything, they almost lean more towards, at least during the early part of the Civil War. I think things begin to change at the end of the Civil War and during Reconstruction. But again, this is getting beyond the scope of this conversation. Put it this way, to be really simplistic, but also not simplistic. It's complicated. Yeah. So, I don't know. Do you want to move?
Let's just wrap this one up then. Balancing its arguments, its strengths and weaknesses. Is this book The Rise and Fall of American Lutheran Pietism. Still worth reading. And maybe, and perhaps to follow up, who should read it if anyone should read it?
Yeah. Well, it's worth reading because it makes an important contribution to this time period in American Lutheran history. It's trying to incorporate Lutherans into the larger story of, what's going on in the broad United States. It's an argument you have to wrestle with, I think, if you're and take seriously. So I think it's one of these books you have to read to be aware of the different arguments about Lutheran identity in the antebellum United States, for sure. Would I personally recommend it and say, yep, this is just what I think on this is, I wouldn't recommend it because I agree with Kuenning's interpretation. I think there's some errors there, but if you're a graduate student, and you're studying American Lutheran history in this time period, you need to be aware of Kuenning's argument and also not reject everything he says out of hand, because he does bring in some very important issues that if one wants to study American Lutheran history in the antebellum era, you have to be attentive to these issues of social activism, political questions, alongside the theological questions. And really, the two, as what Kuenning shows, and I think he's right, the two things are interrelated. How one approaches politics and issues of social activism, social justice, if we want to use that word, that has a relationship with your theological ideas. I just think that Kuenning doesn't always get the historical record quite correctly. How about that?
Yeah, I think that's a fair, balanced recommendation.
I'm all about balance.
Yeah. Be so balanced, no one knows what you actually think. No.
Hey, that's what I try to get with my students. I don't want them to always know what I think, because I want them to kind of wrestle with the evidence themselves.